Hi, I'm Steve McGuckin. I'm an associate editor at Northern Slant, and I'm here with my colleagues Julia Flanagan, Michael Avila, and Jamie Powell as we take a look at some of the issues surrounding this most unprecedented of US presidential elections. Plenty has changed since we originally planned to have this discussion as part of the Imagine Festival back in March. Then we were in the middle of the primaries. Now, with 3 weeks to go until Election Day, you get a real sense that literally anything can happen. We're staring down the barrel of 250,000 deaths from a global pandemic that again seems to be running out of control, particularly around the White House itself. The US economy is suffering some fundamental damage that will take years to repair, and we have an increasingly desperate administration battling against consistently bad poll numbers all across a nation that seems more divided than at any time in recent years. Just as the election has become more unpredictable and intense, is increased in significance, not just for the US, but for the rest of the world, and also for us here in the relationships between Ireland, North and South, the US, and Britain in light of the ongoing Brexit situation. So we have plenty to talk about, and we're grateful that most of our excellent original panel is still able to take part. They bring experience and insight into where things stand, how things might play out over the final weeks, and most important of all, what it all might mean for Northern Ireland, no matter who wins. We asked them some questions and they recorded their answers over the past few days. But as we've become used to with this campaign, 24 hours can genuinely feel like a week. So we'd like to thank them all, as well as the folks at the Imagine Festival and what was going to be our original hosts at the Dark Horse Bar in Belfast Cathedral Quarter. All being well, it won't be too long before we're back having these sorts of conversations in person. So I'm going to hand over to my Northern Slant colleagues now to guide us through the discussion. Michael, have you voted?
Yes, Steve, I have done my civic duty, and I'm just happy I was able to figure out the absentee ballot process, as it was quite difficult. But yeah, what a year. What's been very encouraging is that we've seen in an article in the Irish Examiner the last few days is that the increase in registered voters of Americans living on, at least in the Republic of Ireland, and probably similar numbers in the North, is that there's been a 200% rise in that. So that's been quite encouraging, and happy to be one of those. I'm going to hand over to Julia Flanagan now, who will assess sort of how she's seen the campaign as someone from Northern Ireland and has worked on the 2016 Hillary campaign as well.
Thanks, Michael. Well, yeah, I mean, definitely, the narrative and the discourse is as divisive as it was in 2016, that's for sure. I mean, it seems that every election year is the most consequential election of our time, but this year it really does feel that way, given the events of the last 4 or 5 years, and especially the last 6 or 7 months, as Steve mentioned, with the pandemic. There is so much to assess. So I'm delighted to introduce our first panelist, Chris Buckler. Chris presents Good Morning Ulster and is a former Washington correspondent. We asked him for his headline impressions about where the election stands.
Earlier this year, back in January and February, before I left Washington, there was this real sense that America and the world more generally should prepare itself for another 4 years of Donald Trump in the White House. If you remember back then, the Democrats did not seem to be behind any particular candidate. Joe Biden had not performed well in a number of the Democratic debates, and actually it felt that there were candidates who wanted to pull the Democrats in very, very different directions. And then in March, everything changed, and it changed with COVID-19. It has left the American economy in a very difficult place. And the truth is that for any sitting president, the greatest threat to them winning another election is the economy not doing well. And that is where Donald Trump finds himself at the moment. Frankly, if people are feeling it in their wallets and their purses, it is going to lead to them making a decision at the ballot box that might not be good for that sitting president. Now, it's difficult to say all of this when you're sitting in Northern Ireland because you don't get an idea of what it is like in those individual states. And it is worth just remembering that it's not really just one vote. It feels like a series of votes across those states, and they all have very different views. But so many of them have been affected by the coronavirus that it is going to have a big, big part to play. It is a fascinating election, and I have no doubt that there are huge numbers of people watching it. But you do get the sense that outside of America, they're looking in on what is a TV show. They are regarding this as the kind of reality TV that Donald Trump became famous for, maybe even a soap opera. And we have seen plenty of twists and turns in the last couple of weeks alone. And you just can't put it past Donald Trump or the American electorate that there won't be another twist before this voting is finally over.
Yeah, I think Chris is absolutely right. And the interesting thing is that Biden has led consistently in the polls right back from the time that he became the Democratic nominee. Jules, what's your impressions of the race and how it's going, and what are some key states to watch in the Senate?
Yeah, well, I think everybody on election night will definitely be watching Trump versus Biden closely, but I just think the Senate races are going to be fascinating. I mean, it's the Senate that really determines how a president, legislates and how their agenda plays out for those 4 years. Biden knows that better than anybody, given that, the Senate during Obama's last 4 years really did dictate, what he was able to do and what he was not able to do. So I think some of the key races, there's going to be the Senate race in Arizona is really shaping up to be very interesting. Senator John McCain, who passed away in 2018, this is his old state. He is Donald Trump's nemesis. And whenever he passed away, his seat was won in a special election by the Republican Martha McSally. Currently, the Democratic challenger and former NASA astronaut Mark Kelly is running a really, really strong campaign. In fact, it's looking like he will actually take that seat from her. There's other elections as well, Senate elections such as South Carolina. The Trump loyalist and current incumbent Lindsey Graham is really facing quite a tight challenge from his Democratic opponent, Jamie Harrison. That's proving to be a fascinating race. In fact, just announced there today that Jamie Harrison in this last quarter has raised something like $57 million, which is just an extraordinary amount of money. So it's going to be fascinating to see, can the Democrats flip the Senate? I doubt that they'll be able to do it, but I think that for entertainment on election night, the Senate's going to be absolutely brilliant to watch, definitely. But now I'm going to hand over to Michael, who's going to introduce our next panelist to talk about the debates, the presidential debates that we've seen so far.
Thank you, Julia. And certainly one of the major events that will impact how different states vote in this election was this last debate, which was quite a doozy of a debate, if you ask me. Obviously, at this point, we know that the second debate will be canceled, but of course, we will catch up in the third and final debate prior to election night. At this point, I'd like to introduce our next panelist, Dr. Julie Norman, who's a teaching fellow in politics and international relations at the University College London. Prior to joining the University College London, Julie was a research fellow at the Mitchell Institute at Queen's University, Belfast. She also has a strong media presence, having been a frequent guest on the BBC, Al Jazeera, France 24, and the host of her own podcast, The Julie Norman Show. Thank you, Julie, for joining us, and she'll discuss the debates and what the effects that will have on the election to come.
Well, the first presidential debate certainly was a new low in U.S. politics. We've known for a while that U.S. politics is quite divisive, quite polarized, but we've never seen something quite like that. Really 90 minutes of interruptions and insults with very little substantial discussion of policy whatsoever. And, as many have stated, that really the biggest loser from that was American voters, many who tuned in hoping for something more substantial than that, at least hoping for something more civil than that, and many people who were very disappointed and turned off by that. But, I think what's notable is that this was seen as an aberration, and it was seen as something that really did, quite frankly, disgust most voters. And I think that underscores that the American people don't want this kind of discourse to become normal. And that's true for people from across the political spectrum. I think most voters are really craving a return to some sense of decency, some sense of civility, regardless of their politics. So it'll be interesting to see first if the next several debates take place as planned due to Trump's current diagnosis with COVID-19, of course, and what format they take. There's also some discussion of maybe trying to have some other kinds of models or restraints for these debates to make them a little bit more civil. But it is unusual, to say the least, when Trump is one of the debaters, just because he brings a very distinct debating style. But with that said, again, Trump's recent diagnosis coming so soon after the debate did take the news cycle off of that. Of course, there were several days of really focusing on some of his most outlandish statements, especially those in terms of refusing to condemn white supremacy, in terms of defending the Proud Boys, in terms of questioning the actual process of the election, and really furthering some conspiracy theories around voting and voting by mail. So there were certainly many things he said that were in the news cycle for a day or two. But his diagnosis just coming several days later that week really did reorient the discussion, so to speak. And even though I know there were many who felt, Trump maybe had it coming, given his dismissiveness towards the virus, at the same time, his diagnosis did bring some level of humanity back in to the race, especially in a week when it had hit that low. We did see, expressions of, well wishes for a speedy recovery, and just messaging from the Biden campaign, messaging from former President Obama, saying, we're all humans, we're all Americans at the end of the day, and that is where our focus should be. So if there's any silver lining to that diagnosis coming so soon after the debate, it might be that, just bringing in a little bit of humanity to a week where that really seemed quite lost.
Jules, what do you think? Any humanity in this campaign now?
Well, if there is or was, it didn't last very long, that's for sure. It is very reassuring at a time whenever politics is very divisive. It is reassuring to see messages like that come from, President Trump's opponent, from, other leaders within the Democratic Party. But it works both ways, and unfortunately, you don't really get the same from President Trump himself. But and I don't think you're going to see it over the course of the next 3 weeks, that's for sure. He certainly didn't extend any sympathy towards the governor of Michigan following the news that there was a kidnap plot against her. So yeah, I think sort of in terms of the discourse, I think it's going to be pretty much what we've seen for the past 4 years continued into the next 3 weeks. Yeah.
Jamie, what do you think? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. No, I was just going to say it was interesting, though, that we did have the vice presidential debate in the middle of all of this. And I suppose there we did get a glimpse of where, yes, there was quite, intense disagreement clearly between the two vice presidential candidates, but at least, it was a civil discussion, bar some of those interruptions, that were quite fraught. But, the tone of the discussion was very different. So it just shows that, even though there is a much bigger difference between the persona and the style of the two presidential candidates, maybe whenever we look beyond them, then we do see glimpses into a more normal kind of politics that Julie was talking about.
I certainly hope so. I think one of the things that we've seen since the president has had his diagnosis is, if you have a White House that gives the impression of accessibility but isn't forthcoming, particularly about something as important as the president's health, then during an election campaign, that the burden of information falls increasingly on the media to make sure that citizens have reliable information on which to base their choices. And we asked Chris Buckler how he thought the press had been performing.
In terms of America, I think it's worth saying that actually, to some extent, political journalism has been eroded in favour of what is essentially Trump journalism. A lot of what is happening in Washington is reflected on the TV screens and in the newspapers, and that is at the expense of the rest of the United States. We are telling the story of DC. We are not necessarily telling the story of America. And that has been a big issue in all of this, because Donald Trump is a fascinating character. He says things that immediately grab attention. He likes to see himself in the spotlight and plays up to that to a certain extent. And actually, we buy into that. And that is a problem for journalism more generally. But there is a big difference to how the world looks at what is happening around the White House and around American politics and what happens inside the US. You know, a lot of focus is paid to what Fox News does, that it is anything but impartial in the way it covers the president. But first of all, it's slightly unfair on Fox News, which does have two divisions. It does have the news division, which tends to be a lot more focused on the facts and trying to look at what the president is saying and holding him to whether or not that is a truthful standard. It must be said, Fox News also does have the opinion strand, which has been absolutely out and out for President Trump non-stop. But actually, if you look at CNN, if you look at MSNBC, if you look at some of the other media as well, there is undoubtedly a certain amount of opinion creeping in. And President Trump would certainly argue that that was against him on a number of occasions. It has left political journalism now in a place where sometimes it isn't about analysis, it is very, very much about opinion. And that divided nature of American politics, which you can see in the streets and you will find talking to anybody if you go to any single diner, that has crept in to how we actually look at news. And that is a real issue for America, I think.
Okay, anyone want to pick up on anything Chris just said?
Go ahead, Joy. Julia.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting point that he made about sort of the way in which journalists have covered. I mean, I was thinking about this the other day. How do journalists cover an unprecedented candidate and presidency like someone like Donald Trump? I mean, there is no rule book, I suppose, but do you report the facts, which is quite often what you see journalists do? Yes, of course, they do bring in their own commentary from time to time, but they are reporting a candidate who is very sort of outlandish and unpredictable, and it's very, very hard to know what is the right way to report somebody like that. But I do think Chris is right about the fact that there is far more coverage on Washington and very, very little coverage on the rest of America and the voters and the people that ultimately do sway this election.
I think as an American, I probably lost faith in our media even prior to 2016. To be honest, it's sort of had this wave of sensationalism. Again, we kind of touched on the surface level and the presentation of things and fancy graphics rather than actual policy. I think that's difficult with obviously the system we had. Media companies are there to make money. That's what they're there to do. But I think again, although I would have said this prior to 2016, that's just been magnified maybe 100 times over by a personality, by Trump. And I would have said it would have been difficult prior to 2016 to get it to a point where, we're having frank and constructive conversations over policy and where the country goes. But now I don't really know how that's rectified.
I think one point that Chris brought out was about Fox News. And John Dean, the famous Watergate lawyer, recently said that if Fox News had been around back then Nixon probably wouldn't have had to resign. And it's invaluable to have an organization like Fox on behalf, going to bat for the president every night, literally as the situation worsens around him. And I'll just pick up one more thing about what you said, Michael, about the regional, and Jules, you mentioned it as well, the regional coverage as opposed to what's happening out of DC. A lot of newspapers, local newspapers, are basically in crisis at the moment. We're seeing a lot of downsizing, a lot of newspapers shrinking. We're heading into what people call news deserts, where in the middle of America there are towns that are used to have 2 or 3 daily newspapers are down to 1 or even none. And what's replacing that in the civic discourse is social media. And luckily we have a social media expert who's going to talk to us now about the role of Facebook in the campaign and how important that is. So Jamie, could you introduce Alina for us?
Yes, of course, Steve. So we're delighted to be joined now by Alina Utrata, who's a PhD candidate at Cambridge University, where she is researching the influence of big tech companies on international relations. And Alina was a Marshall Scholar at the Mitchell Institute at Queen's University, Belfast, and she completed her undergraduate studies in history and law at Stanford.
Hi, I'm Alina Utrata. I'm a PhD student studying at the University of Cambridge. And today I've been asked to talk about how social media is impacting the elections. So there's three key takeaways I think is important to know going into the 2020 election. The first is they have your data and they're using it. So Cambridge Analytica is sort of the most infamous or well-known example of how the information that platforms collect about us and our behavior can be used for political purposes. But they're really just one example of a really wide ecosystem and economy of surveillance capitalism has developed. And in many ways, this is not necessarily that different from historically what political campaigns have always done in terms of collecting information about potential voters. However, I think the key difference is the amount of information that is available about individuals and the ability to micro-target individuals with political advertisements or information. The second important thing to note is that it's not just about the content that is allowed to be posted, but it's about what you see and why you see it. So there's been some very public disputes between the social media platforms and politicians, most notably Donald Trump, about what can and cannot be posted on platforms. But this sort of obscures the fact that one of the larger issues about these platforms is the algorithms and in particular the news feed. So historically, if a political candidate wanted to take out a political advertisement, maybe they would put it in the newspaper, maybe they would buy a billboard, but everybody in the community would see that same exact advertisement. There's no way to send advertisement 1 to person A and advertisement 2 to person B. The Facebook newsfeed and the Twitter feed make this possible. So it's possible that politicians can say one thing to you and they can say a completely different thing to your neighbor or your mom. And this is a really unique challenge, I think, for political discourse in democratic elections that I just don't think is precedented, and we just don't know how that is affecting politics. And that leads me on to the final thing, which is that we don't know what we don't know. So we have some examples of how Facebook and Twitter and different social media companies affected politics last time, but we do not have any long-term information about how in the long run social media platforms will affect democratic politics. So I'm sure for years and years after the 2020 election, we'll be learning about how social media impacted the campaign and the election result.
Yeah, anybody want to pick up on anything that Alina said?
She's certainly right not to predict anything about 2020 moving forward, if this year has told us anything. I think on the social media thing, I mean, I might sort of have a pretty libertarian view on that, and I sort of believe that it's on people to gather their own facts and fact check themselves and come to their own conclusion on everything. Although that's much more difficult for some people than others. But I think what's happening now is that you're seeing these algorithms that are seeing what people are into, whether that's their political candidates or their slants. And I think American politics over my lifetime has been pretty ideologically driven, but I think social media is pushing people further and further into those silos, which is why we're seeing some of the social unrest now.
It's also interesting just to think about, the fact that social media is being used to, mobilize certain groups or to, to discourage certain groups maybe from participating in politics, which isn't, I suppose, that new. It's been around for many election cycles about certain parties trying to push their vote out and to discourage the voters of the opposition from turning out. But it is maybe just more striking how visible it is in America, you know, even beyond social media, when we look at how difficult it is maybe to register to vote in certain states, you know, extra barriers that exist in the US context that, you know, would surprise us on the other side of the Atlantic. And even when we see those, you know, long queues of people to vote, you know, sometimes, you know, that's framed as a way, you know, look at, you know, how, you know, energetic people are, but usually that can be a sign that it's actually quite difficult to vote, that there aren't enough polling stations to, you know, where it's easy for people to actually cast a ballot. So I think that whenever we think about social media and how it's used, it also brings us to all of the other things that we can see are obstacles to encouraging people to participate.
Yeah, it's interesting actually you mentioned that, Jamie, because I know Facebook recently said that they were going to restrict the amount of political content that was going to be available in the week running up to the election. It seems a pretty arbitrary way to impose that barrier. But one of the effects of that is that it could have a detrimental effect on legitimate get out the vote efforts and voter education outreach and stuff like that. So, you know, it's a double-edged sword, basically.
Mm-hmm.
So I think one of the main takeaways of this election will be the importance of trust and what are the consequences when it's been shown to be broken. The new Bob Woodward book, Rage, for example, lays out how the administration was aware of the potential damage of the coronavirus very early on while the president was publicly playing it down. So the question, though, will be how important will revelations like that turn out to be? Are there enough undecided voters who might be swayed by something like that? Or are the sides just too entrenched by now? In the next part of our discussion, we'll look at trust on a global scale and what the outcome of the election means for the rest of the world, and particularly how it impacts us here in Northern Ireland.